Well, greetings, Pastor Eric here from Zion Lutheran Church. We're on day 27. We're in beautiful Redmond, Oregon. Good to be with you today. We're on chapter 13, verses 21 through 30. Interesting part of the upper room discourse where Jesus shares the meal with the disciples. Let me read that section. Chapter 13, verse 21. After saying this, that we talked about yesterday about washing your feet, Jesus talked a little bit more in 21, verse 21. After saying this, Jesus was very troubled in spirit and declared, "Very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. They didn't even know at this time that Judas was going to betray him, that he'd already gone and gotten the 30 pieces of silver and all that. The disciples did not know. Judas was one that they did not suspect at this time was going to betray Jesus. So they looked at each other, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of the disciples, who was one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. We'll talk about that toward the end, about the beloved disciple. The one whom Jesus loved was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore mentioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. "Hey, beloved disciple, tell us who it is that Jesus is talking about." Verse 25. So reclining next to him, Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish of wine." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After receiving the piece of bread dipped in wine, Satan entered into Judas. Jesus said to him, "Do quickly what you are going to do." Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to Judas. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, he was a CPA of the group, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the festival, or that he should go give something to the poor. Totally unsuspecting. So after receiving the piece of bread, Judas immediately went out, and it was night. And it was night. Think about Judas betraying Jesus. What's interesting about Judas is that the gospel writers portray him differently. The gospel writers are not even of the same mind when they talk about Judas. Judas was the one from Judea. All the other disciples were right there from Galilee. That may, since he was kind of a foreigner, he was from Judea, not from Galilee, that may have made Judas feel a little bit inferior, not quite in with the in crowd. Maybe Judas struggled with that. Judas was probably more educated than the other disciples. Some of them were fishermen, some were tax collectors, but Judas held the common purse. He must have had some type of CPA degree because he was trusted enough to hold the money for the disciples. The only words we hear from Judas are when he protests that 300 pieces of money were used for ointment that Mary poured out on Jesus when she anointed him. Judas said, hey, that money was wasted. We could have used it to feed the poor. Of course, he wasn't going to use it to feed the poor. He was going to use it to keep up that money purse that he had controlled over. Even in the scene in Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, Judas is at table with Jesus, and there's a spilled salt shaker at his hand, which leads to the tradition of salt being bad luck, or throwing salt over your left shoulder, because the left shoulder is the side where the devil wants to enter into your heart, where the devil entered into Judas's heart to betray Jesus. So, like I said, the gospel writers portrayed Judas a little bit differently. Mark almost portrays Judas as a part of the larger plan for Jesus to endure the pain and suffering of the cross, so that in the Gospel of Mark, when the centurion looked up at Jesus and said, truly, this man was God's son, everything kind of leads toward that, including the betrayal of Jesus by Judas. Matthew and Luke, it's a little bit different. The betrayal of Jesus by Judas was a part of Satan's plan, not Jesus' plan, as it seems to be even a little bit in the Gospel of Mark, where it's Satan's plan to enter into the heart of Judas. At the beginning of Luke, when Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, the devil departed from Jesus until, Luke writes, an opportune time. The opportune time came later in the Gospel of Luke when the devil entered into Satan Iscariot to betray Jesus. So Judas is portrayed differently. The Gospel of John that we've been looking at is even a little more different, because even though it's presumed that Jesus gave bread and wine to all the disciples in the section I just read, Judas is the only one to whom Jesus specifically gave the bread dipped in the wine after he received that morsel. So what I'm saying is, in the Gospel of John, Judas is portrayed as the only one specifically who did receive the bread dipped in the wine. And after receiving the morsel, John writes, so after receiving the morsel, he immediately went out, and it was night. And it was night. In the Gospel of John, we've seen that duality of light and darkness, good and evil, belief and unbelief, God and Satan. Judas goes out, and it was night, in utter darkness and unbelief in Satan's realm. Judas went out, and it was night. Judas, the one that the disciples and Jesus had trusted so much, Judas went out, and it was night. There's no light in the betrayal of Jesus by Judas. Judas is one where, as his life ends, it apparently is legend that he went out and hanged himself. In the Gospel of Acts, we read a little bit about that. Judas turned his back on Jesus. Judas still received the bread and wine, and even though Jesus knew what he was going to do, Jesus still communed Judas. Judas tells us about it's kind of a confrontation with what's the level of grace that's tolerable in our lives. Jesus communed Judas. That has always just baffled me. If I were Jesus, which I'm not, I would have said, Judas, why don't you go? And I would have communed the rest of the disciples, but not Judas. But Jesus communes Judas, which confronts us with the limits of grace. Jesus communed Judas. So the story of Judas is not about human values or religious law. The story of Judas is about the extent, the realm, the bigger circle of God's love and grace and forgiveness. Judas is firmly planted in the story of Jesus, pushing us to think about what are the limits of grace, what are the limits of love. Judas betrayed Jesus, and yet Jesus still communed him. Just think about that today. It's one of the stunning things about the Gospel of John and the whole issue of the limits of grace in our lives, because Jesus communed Judas. I wouldn't have done it. Maybe you wouldn't have, but Jesus did. And that's an anchoring of grace for all of us. I'm going to read May 13th for Jesus Calling, which reads in this way. Thank me in the midst of the crucible. When things seem all wrong, look for growth opportunities. Especially look for areas where you need to let go, leaving your cares in my able hands. Do you trust me to orchestrate your life events as I choose? Or are you still trying to make things go according to your will? If you keep trying to carry out your intentions while I am leading you in another direction, you deify your desires. Be on the lookout for what I am doing in your life. Worship me by living close to me, thanking me in all circumstances. All circumstances. That's it for today, day 27. I look forward, day 20, whatever it is now, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Take care until then. Bye-bye.